Well, I had the same feeling, and I'm sure a lot of other people did. I know, I remember Sarah Miles.
He wasn't just annoyed, he wasn't just irritated. Robert Mitchum truly hated him. In a town built on polite smiles and quiet rivalries, Robert Mitchum's hatred stood out because it was raw, honest, and never disguised. Among all the actors he crossed paths with during his long, turbulent career, there was one man he despised more than anyone else. That man was Robert Ryan. This wasn't a feud fueled by gossip columns or on-set explosions. There were no public shouting matches, no dramatic reconciliations, just a deep, enduring contempt that followed Mitchum for decades, long after most Hollywood grudges had faded into polite indifference. And the truth is, Mitchum didn't hate Robert Ryan because he was weak. He didn't hate him because he lacked talent. In fact, Mitchum never denied Ryan's ability. He hated him because Robert Ryan represented everything Robert Mitchum refused to be. To understand that hatred, you have to understand the man who carried it. Robert Mitchum wasn't born into comfort or certainty. He entered the world on August 6, 1917, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, into instability, hardship, and loss. When Mitchum was just 2 years old, his father, a railroad worker, was killed in a tragic accident, leaving his mother to raise her children under relentless financial and emotional strain. That early loss carved something permanent into Mitchum's character. From a young age, he learned that life was unforgiving, authority was unreliable, and survival required toughness, not obedience. As he grew older, he drifted through a string of hard, unglamorous jobs. He dug ditches, worked factory floors, boxed for money, slept wherever he could. At times, he lived on the edge of vagrancy, moving through the world with no safety net and no illusions. This wasn't rebellion for attention. It was instinct. Those years hardened him, but they also shaped the quiet defiance that would later define both his screen presence and his personal code. Mitchum didn't trust systems, he didn't respect moral lectures, and he had no patience for people who believed they had life figured out. Hollywood came into his life almost by accident in the early 1940s. He took small, uncredited roles, barely noticeable at first. But when his breakthrough finally arrived in the story of G.I. Joe in 1945, it was impossible to ignore. Mitchum's performance wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, it didn't beg for approval, it was restrained, weary, and real. That subtle power earned him an Academy Award nomination and instantly separated him from the polished, carefully trained stars of his generation. Mitchum acted the way he lived, instinctively, without apology, and without explaining himself. And it was this exact philosophy that would one day put him on a permanent collision course with Robert Ryan. Because while Mitchum believed acting was something you felt, Ryan believed it was something you analyzed, and Mitchum never forgave him for that. As Robert Mitchum's career gained momentum, it became clear that he was never going to fit neatly into Hollywood's expectations. While other actors chased approval, Mitchum moved in the opposite direction. He spoke less, showed less, and cared even less about being liked. What mattered to him was a truth, raw, unpolished, and instinctive. It was in film noir that this philosophy found its purest expression. In Out of the Past, in 1947, Mitchum delivered what many still consider one of the definitive performances of the genre. His character, Jeff Bailey, wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He was tired, haunted, fully aware that his past would eventually catch up to him. Mitchum didn't dramatize that fate, he accepted it. With his relaxed posture, half-lidded eyes, and seemingly casual delivery, he created a man who understood the cost of his choices and no longer fought against them. There was no grand moral reckoning, no speeches about redemption, just quiet resignation and weary grace. Audiences felt it immediately. This was something new, a kind of masculinity that didn't announce itself, a presence that suggested danger without ever raising its voice. Mitchum wasn't acting suffering, he was carrying it, and that authenticity became his signature. He perfected it again and again in noir roles, building a reputation as the ultimate anti-hero, cynical, detached, yet strangely romantic, a man who didn't believe in clean endings or moral absolutes. Then, in 1955, he shattered any lingering doubt about his range with The Night of the Hunter. As the sinister preacher Harry Powell, Mitchum transformed into something quietly terrifying. His soft-spoken menace, the infamous love and hate tattooed across his knuckles, and his eerie calm created one of cinema's most unforgettable villains. It wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, it was controlled, precise, and utterly chilling. That performance proved something important. Mitchum wasn't limited by his laid-back persona. He could be as frightening as he was charismatic, as seductive as he was dangerous. Yet despite his growing success, Mitchum never softened his attitude toward Hollywood itself. He mocked the studio system openly. He ignored publicity rituals. He refused to pretend that filmmaking was some sacred moral enterprise. To Mitchum, it was a craft. Nothing more, nothing less. That rebellious indifference reached a peak in 1948 when he was arrested for marijuana possession. In many careers, that moment would have ended everything. For Mitchum, it only reinforced the legend. He served time, emerged unapologetic, and famously joked that jail was like Palm Springs without the riffraff. The industry braced for backlash. Instead, audiences embraced him even more. His outlaw image didn't repel people, it fascinated them. Mitchum wasn't pretending to be rebellious. He simply was. And as his career expanded beyond the noir into westerns, war films, thrillers, and romantic dramas, he carried that same philosophy with him. In films like El Dorado and The Wonderful Country, he portrayed men shaped by violence and solitude, men who carried emotional scars beneath stoic exteriors. Even in romance, his charm worked precisely because it avoided sentimentality. He conveyed tenderness without speeches, longing without confession. All of it came from instinct, not analysis, and that was the line he would never cross. Because somewhere else in Hollywood, Robert Ryan was doing the opposite, preparing intensely, dissecting motivation, and treating every role like a moral battleground. And Mitchum was already watching him with growing irritation. By the time Robert Mitchum became a Hollywood icon, the world thought it understood him. They saw the heavy-lidded stare, the gravelly voice, the calm defiance, the outlaw charm that made him look like a man who couldn't be owned by anyone, not even the studios that paid him. But the truth was, someone had known him long before all of that. Her name was Dorothy Spence. Mitchum married Dorothy in March of 1940, years before the fame, before the scandals, before the legend hardened into myth. Back then, he wasn't Robert Mitchum, the star. He was just a struggling young actor, still carrying the rough edges of a life that had taught him not to trust stability. Dorothy was different. Grounded, practical, devoted to family, the kind of person who didn't fall in love with a persona, because there was no persona yet. She married the real man, before the world started projecting fantasies onto him. Together, they had 3 children, and despite everything, Mitchum carried a genuine emotional attachment to them. People close to the family often noticed the contradiction that followed him everywhere, the public rebel versus the private father. Mitchum wasn't sentimental. He rarely spoke openly about feelings. He didn't wrap his love in pretty words. But the sense of responsibility toward his children remained one of the few steady threads in his life. And still, the marriage was never simple, because Mitchum's private world contained the same truth as his public one. He did what he wanted, when he wanted, and he rarely apologized for it. He was notoriously unfaithful. His affairs were an open secret in Hollywood, fueled by his rugged looks, his immense charm, and a lifestyle that welcomed temptation the way most men welcomed comfort. And Mitchum didn't deny it. He didn't dress it up with excuses. He carried the same unapologetic candor that defined his entire personality. That was the painful paradox of their relationship. Deep loyalty, repeated betrayal, a bond that endured, even when the terms were unfair. And yet, despite everything, Dorothy stayed. In an industry where marriages collapsed under fame, ego, and a scandal, theirs lasted nearly 60 years, until Mitchum's death in 1997. Dorothy endured the infidelities, the instability, the rebelliousness, and the constant scrutiny that followed a man who seemed incapable of being tamed. What that longevity suggested wasn't a fairy tale romance, it was something more complicated. A marriage rooted in shared history, mutual dependence, and an unspoken agreement to carry each other's flaws without trying to fix them. And that detail matters because Mitchum couldn't stand being judged. He could accept anger, he could accept hate, he could accept consequences. But quiet moral condemnation, the kind that comes from a person who believes they're better than you, that was the one thing Mitchum could never tolerate. And this is where the shadow of Robert Ryan begins to creep closer. Because among all the men Mitchum dealt with in Hollywood, studio bosses, directors, actors, critics, there was one type he despised above all others. The self-serious moralist, the man who looked at you like you needed fixing, and in Mitchum's eyes, Robert Ryan didn't just represent that type. Robert Ryan was that type. Among all the actors Robert Mitchum encountered during his long and combustible career, none provoked the same lasting irritation, distrust, and open contempt as Robert Ryan. This wasn't casual dislike. It wasn't a personality clash that faded with time. It was something deeper, ideological, permanent. Mitchum was famous for his indifference to Hollywood politics and his instinctive dislike of pretension. But what he felt toward Ryan went far beyond annoyance. In his mind, Ryan embodied everything that had begun to suffocate the industry Mitchum had never fully respected to begin with. Ryan took acting seriously, too seriously. He cultivated an image of intellectual gravity, moral reflection, and political engagement. He spoke openly about causes, responsibility, and conscience. To many in Hollywood, this made him admirable. To Mitchum, it made him unbearable. Mitchum once dismissed Ryan with brutal simplicity, saying he took himself far too seriously for a business that was mostly make-believe. That line wasn't a joke, it was a verdict. To Mitchum, acting was a craft meant to be lived instinctively, not dissected or moralized. You stepped into a role, told the truth of the moment, and walked away. You didn't turn it into a sermon, you didn't apologize for it, and you certainly didn't use it to position yourself above others. Ryan did all of that. He prepared intensely, brooding over motivation, subtext, and meaning. He treated every scene like a moral examination of human suffering. Mitchum found it exhausting and faintly ridiculous. What Ryan called discipline, Mitchum once remarked, felt like joyless obsession. Mitchum believed life wasn't lived at that pitch. People didn't walk around drenched in constant moral tension. They laughed, they sinned, they contradicted themselves, and they didn't explain every impulse. Ryan, by contrast, felt wound tight. And that tension bled into everything. Their ideological differences only widened the divide. Ryan was outspoken about his liberal political beliefs and social causes. Mitchum leaned fiercely independent, deeply suspicious of movements, slogans, and moral crusades, especially when they came from people insulated by fame and privilege. To Mitchum, Hollywood loved to preach because it never had to pay the price. Of Ryan's political engagement, Mitchum sneered that he loved to lecture but never listened. He believed Ryan's convictions weren't lived. They were performed. Another role played with grim dedication. On set, the contrast between them was unmistakable. Mitchum conserved energy. He stayed loose. He trusted his instincts and waited for the camera. Ryan arrived prepared, intense, already carrying the weight of the scene on his shoulders. Mitchum hated that atmosphere. He once summed it up with devastating simplicity. Sometimes it's just a scene. What Ryan considered seriousness, Mitchum saw as self-importance. But the resentment didn't stop there. Ryan was known to carry guilt over playing violent characters, especially later in life. He spoke openly about his discomfort with screen brutality. Mitchum found this attitude absurdly self-righteous. In his view, an actor's job was not to apologize for the story, but to tell it honestly. If you're ashamed of the part, Mitchum said, you shouldn't be playing it. Ryan's visible unease felt, to Mitchum, like a betrayal of the profession. And beneath all of it, unspoken but unmistakable, was judgment. Mitchum knew Ryan disapproved of his lifestyle, the arrests, the affairs, the refusal to clean himself up for respectability, and Mitchum loathed nothing more than quiet moral condemnation. He looked at you like you needed fixing, Mitchum said. I never liked people who thought they were better than the room. That look, that silent disapproval, hardened something in Mitchum that never softened again. Most Hollywood feuds burn hot, then cool into something harmless. Time passes, careers shift, people age, pride dulls, and eventually even the most bitter rivalries get rewritten into polite anecdotes. Something to laugh about at a dinner party, something to shrug off with a nostalgic smile. But Robert Mitchum's feelings toward Robert Ryan didn't work that way. They never softened. Even years later, Mitchum spoke of Ryan with the same mix of irritation and disdain, as if the conflict wasn't part of the past, but something still alive in his chest. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no quiet moment of mutual respect, no mellowing with age. Mitchum accepted that they were simply incompatible men. Some people, he said, just rub you wrong forever. And Ryan was one of those. What made it different was that Mitchum's hatred wasn't rooted in one explosive incident. It wasn't one argument, one betrayal, one humiliation. It was a fundamental clash of worldview, two ways of existing that could never share the same air without friction. Ryan sought meaning, Mitchum sought freedom. Ryan embraced responsibility, Mitchum embraced defiance. And the irony was that they weren't opposites because one was good and the other was bad. They were opposites because they were both strong. Both were often cast as heavy, morally conflicted figures. Both excelled at projecting menace. Both carried a kind of darkness that audiences couldn't look away from. There was an undercurrent of rivalry in that, though Mitchum would never admit it. But in Mitchum's mind, Ryan lacked something essential: humor, sensuality, the looseness that made a person feel alive. Mitchum believed Ryan was all tension with no release. People don't live like that, he said. To Mitchum, Ryan's performances, however admired, felt emotionally incomplete because real life wasn't a constant moral sermon. Life was contradiction. Life was impulse. Life was doing things you couldn't fully explain and refusing to pretend you were pure. And that was why Ryan's decency didn't feel like virtue to Mitchum. It felt like accusation. In Mitchum's eyes, Ryan's moral seriousness wasn't merely a personality trait. It was a silent judgment of everyone around him, a look that said, "You are flawed and I am not." And Mitchum, a man with arrests behind him, scandals attached to his name, and a life lived unapologetically, could not tolerate that kind of quiet superiority. That was the core of it. Not jealousy, not competition, not even politics, just that unbearable sensation of being looked down on by someone who believed they were better than the room. And Mitchum never forgave that. Robert Mitchum carried his defiance far beyond the screen. He never rebranded himself for age. He never apologized for the past. And he never pretended the consequences wouldn't come. From his youth onward, Mitchum was a notoriously heavy smoker. Cigarettes were as much a part of his image as his gravelly voice and unbothered stare. He didn't hide the habit. He didn't dramatize it. It was simply another expression of how he lived, without caution, without fear, and without illusion. But time, unlike Hollywood, does not negotiate. Decades of relentless smoking took their toll, quietly, patiently. And in the early hours of July 1st, 1997, the cost finally came due. At approximately 5 a.m., in his home in Santa Barbara, California, Robert Mitchum died peacefully in his sleep. The cause was complications from lung cancer and emphysema, diseases that stood in stark contrast to the rugged vitality he had projected for so long. There were no flashing cameras, no final performance, no dramatic last words, just the stillness of dawn. At his side was Dorothy Mitchum, his wife of nearly 60 years, the woman who had known him before the legend, who had endured the fame, the scandals, the betrayals, and the long stretches of emotional distance. She had stood beside him through triumph and decline, through applause and silence. Their marriage, often tested but never broken, outlasted most Hollywood careers and far outlived the myths built around him. With Mitchum's passing, an era quietly ended. He had been one of cinema's last true originals, a man whose weary eyes, sardonic smile, and unmistakable voice defined a certain kind of American masculinity, one that didn't ask permission and didn't seek forgiveness. And yet, even in death, the thing that defined him most wasn't the roles, the scandals, or the rebellion. It was his refusal to be anything other than himself. That was why his hatred of Robert Ryan never faded, because in Ryan, Mitchum didn't see a villain. He saw a mirror of everything he rejected. Where Ryan searched for meaning, Mitchum chose freedom. Where Ryan embraced responsibility, Mitchum embraced defiance. Ryan represented the man Mitchum refused to become. And so the hatred remained, not loud, not theatrical, but enduring, a final proof that Robert Mitchum lived and died by the same code: unapologetic, uncompromising, and utterly unmoved.